everyone. Welcome to our special webinar that we have today with our friend Sebastian Manhart, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Carbonfuture, where he's going to update us on the latest CDR policy developments in Europe. If you haven't already, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us where you're coming from, and introduce yourself to everyone else we have on. I'm Megha Raghavan. I am an OpenAir member based in London, and I work on policy and market development. If you're new to us, just some quick background on OpenAir. We're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the responsible advancement of carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, solutions, which are essential to solving the climate crisis. Our growing global community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of policy, innovation, communications, and CDR market development. And we're going to put some links into the chat. We'll give you our website as well as our Twitter. So please do follow us on Twitter and join us on the join link if you're interested in learning more. In terms of format, we're going to start with a discussion between Seb and OpenAir's Toby Bryce, and then we will be following that by a few paired questions. Then I'll come back on and moderate audience Q&A. So as we go along, and if you think of any questions, please put them in the Q&A box in Zoom. It's a separate one from the chat box, so just make sure you find the right one. It just helps us to organize the questions a little bit easier. We're also going to record the event, so we'll send that link to all of you who registered, and we'll post it to OpenAir's website and to OpenAir's YouTube channel. So I think whenever you guys are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Megha. Hello, Sebastian. Hello, everyone.
Hi. Nice to see you again.
Yes, likewise. Thanks for being with us, and thanks to the audience for being with us. I'm very excited for this conversation. Probably most people already know you, Sebastian, but do you want to give a quick intro and talk about where you came from, how you came to climate and carbon, and a little bit about your role at Carbonfuture?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, like many, I probably stumbled into carbon removal from another career. So my background is I'm an economist, studied in the UK, the US, but I was actually a tech entrepreneur for 10 years in the UK, focusing on building technology for the global health, global development sector, mainly in Africa and Asia. In 2020, and this is probably the link also to policy, what got me into policy, I had a request from the German Chancellery, then Angela Merkel, to join essentially as a lobbyist in Brussels for Angela Merkel's office. And I did that for 2 years, and that definitely opened my eyes to policy in Europe, and that's where the passion started. And then how I got into carbon removal, because I was really working on digitization, Web3, but I was very keen on climate tech. And actually, a shout out to Naeem Merchant and the Carbon Curve, because his podcast was actually where I used to work with him in global health. And then I saw that he had a podcast on climate tech, and I didn't know what it was about. I listened to it, and I remember that I was totally hooked. It was actually, and funnily enough, it was an episode with Chris Neidl. I remember it was around a year and a half ago. And I got totally hooked. And then I went deep into CDR. And there I kind of had two options, entrepreneur, policy. And I decided that the best bang for my buck was on policy, because we can really shape the rules for the next decades to come. What I do, I mean, for those who don't know Carbonfuture, we build essentially the trust infrastructure for durable carbon removal. So we do two things. We have a digital MRV Plus product that seamlessly integrates the whole durable CDR life cycle. And we are the leading marketplace with, I think, almost 40%, if I looked last time, of the market share for durable carbon removal credits. So my job is really to promote all durable carbon removal wherever I can. That means primarily, direct air capture, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, biochar carbon removal, enhanced rock weathering, increasingly interested in oceans as well, and ocean carbon removal, and really making sure that we have the right policies in place in Europe, in the US, and the UN as well. I wear a couple of other hats that I should briefly mention. I am a founding director of the US Biochar Coalition. I am the chair of the board, which we might talk about, of the newly founded Deutscher Verband für Negative Emissionen, or basically the CDR Germany trade association, where I'm also interested in things that go beyond kind of the pure remit that I have at Carbonfuture. But yeah, so broadly focused on carbon removal policy in the world.
Got a lot going on, and we will put these links in the chat, but Sebastian's LinkedIn and Twitter are provide a wealth of information about carbon removal policy and other carbon removal topics. So definitely please follow Sebastian on LinkedIn and Twitter. Just to get started talking about EU policy, do you think maybe you could just take a step back and abstract out a little bit and just kind of give us a sense of, I guess, first of all, how does EU policy work between sort of European level policy, nation state level policy, and then maybe what are the kind of like high level key frameworks and parameters that are relevant to carbon removal?
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, not everyone's as deep in the weeds on EU policy. I mean, what you need to know is, at its most basic, Europe has 27 member states. And it's a system where the EU itself, and I'll explain what that means, sets the minimum bar that nation states usually adopt, and then they can go beyond, but not below. So when you think about climate policy, for example, climate targets, the EU has set a 2050 net zero target that sets the minimum bar for all 27 member states. And then they can go beyond. And many have set 2045 net zero targets, for example. So that is, I would say, the at its most basic. There's three institutions in Europe that you'll probably have heard about. There's the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. And when you're trying to pass something, they all three have to essentially at the end agree in what is called the trilogue, a process of these three, on a set piece of legislation before it gets passed. The Commission, think of it as a technocratic body of experts, of bureaucrats who essentially develop the first proposal for everything. The Parliament is an elected body with representatives from all the different member states. It's democratically elected, and it has parties like any national government. And then you've got the Council, which has essentially 27 representatives representing the most relevant ministry for the topic at hand. So it's the nation states represented directly. And all of these you have to work with individually when you're thinking about policy. Now, maybe on climate policy, like EU climate policy, I mentioned the big one, which is the 2050 net zero target. That's the North Star. We've got a 2030 55 emission reduction target. And then there's a big glaring gap in between, which we might talk about later. But 2040 is still a bit of a black box that the European Commission is currently working on. The key vehicles to achieve net zero in Europe are three things that, again, you might have heard of, but I think it's helpful to kind of put them together. One is the emission trading scheme, the biggest compliance market in the world, which hopefully we'll talk about more because it's very relevant for CDR. And this covers, power and heat generation, oil refineries, iron and steel production, kind of the heavy polluting industries. Then you've got the emission sharing regulation, which covers basically all the other sectors: transportation, buildings, waste, agriculture. And then you've got the land use change and forestry, so the LULUCF sector. These three cover all emissions essentially in Europe. And this is where we need to plug in CDR at different points if we want to get to net zero. But yeah, maybe I'll take a break there before I dive deeper into CDR.
Yeah, definitely. And then, so that's kind of at the European level. Maybe can you talk about how, actually, let's go ahead and instead of that, well, why don't we drill into a couple of these policy frameworks? Maybe we'll start with the CRCF, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, which is a very hot topic right now. And we can put a link to the chat to an open period of comment, and would love to maybe just get an overview of what it is, what's going on with this comment period, and then maybe some follow-ups from there.
Yeah, so I just mentioned these kind of the ETS, the ESR, the LULUCF, and there's a bunch of other smaller climate policy frameworks hovering around. What they're missing is CDR. And the way that Europe is approaching it, it's essentially creating the building block that then it can be slotted into all these different pieces of legislation. And that's the CRCF. CRCF stands for Carbon Removal Certification Framework. And I mean, there's different takes, but for me, it's potentially the most impactful, important piece of legislation for CDR in the world that's being negotiated right now. And why? I mean, first, it's really robust. It's hundreds of experts over several years developing certification to answer a simple question of what does good CDR look like. And that's pretty unique. No one else has done that to date. Second, what impact could the CRCF have? Before I explain what it is, I think it's important to start with the why. It's going to be the building block for other climate legislation, but it's also going to influence national policy. If you are Germany or if you are Italy and you're talking about CDR in your ministry, you're not going to reinvent the wheel. You're going to rely on European certification for carbon removal and what's already been done there. Third, it will impact the VCM. If I'm a private sector buyer, I will probably look at what Europe is deciding, both because compliance might come down the line in a few years, but also because it's clearly taken a lot of time to determine what permanent removal is, for example, and I might look at it as the gold standard. And other governments might follow suit. If you think about the GDPR for data protection, other governments around the world have emulated what Europe has done on data protection. But so much as to the impact of what it could do. What is the CRCF? So the CRCF essentially certifies carbon removal, and it does so by creating 3 categories, which a lot of people have issues with. They're quite arbitrary. One is carbon products. The second one is carbon farming or soil carbon. And the third one is permanent removals. Now, you have to fit into one of these 3 categories. And this is, I think, the first challenge that we found with this framework. But I'll dive into more details on especially the permanent removals. Now, it was first released by the Commission. I said the Commission is always the first that kind of releases the draft in November. And there were immediately a couple of key issues in this thing, right? The first thing is it was focused, it still had peatland restoration and especially emission reductions in it. And people were like, what is emission reduction doing in a carbon removal framework? And bad news is it's still in there and it's probably going to get bigger. The second thing is it was focusing only on geological storage, specifically, DACs and BECs, excluding with that pretty much any other CDR methodology. And the third one was there were no details on how it's going to be used. And to date, the Commission is refusing to address anything in terms of how the CSCF is going to be used. And what's happened since then, and maybe where we're going, again, thinking of the 3 institutions that I mentioned, because they all work in parallel on this file right now. The EU Com is doing a bunch of things, the Commission. So one is they currently have an open call until the 15th of September for methodologies, essentially. If you are a standard provider, if you are building MRV products for carbon removal, you should be submitting to this call, because they essentially want to build on the VCM standards and MRVs for their own certification. So please submit. And then in end of October 25th, 26th, another very important date, there's going to be the next meeting on 2 days just on industrial carbon removal. And you'll be able to tune in live if you want. It's very open. And this is when really these 100 people who are debating what permanent removal should look like are going to discuss. On the Parliament side, there's 2 committees, Environment and Agriculture, that are working on it. Agriculture has already submitted its position. Interesting things are, 1, biochar carbon removal plays a very big role. They're pushing for it to be deemed permanent removal alongside DACs and BECs. And second, they want to expand soil carbon pretty much everywhere, as expected from an agriculture committee, which is not unproblematic. And ENVI is going to submit their take later this month. And in October, the Parliament's going to vote. So this is an important date. Parliament's going to vote in October. The Council has submitted their comments. And what's nice about what I've seen there is they're pushing hard for expanding the storage from geological to also lithospheric, which essentially now opens up the door to way more carbon removal methods. And that's probably going to go through, because I've seen this also in the Parliament. And when you have 2 or 3 institutions pushing in a direction, it's probably going to happen. So all to say, kind of the key things that I see that are happening is storage is being expanded. Biochar carbon removal is probably going to be added to DACs and BECs as permanent removal, and reductions will probably stay in this framework. There's just too much political drive behind it.
A couple follow-up questions. I just posted the language that Sebastian was referring to from the Agriculture Committee in the chat, mislabeled as Chris Neidl, but that was me. And so I read that as being very hopeful, because my big concern about the CRCF was that it was picking a relatively small number of winners from the larger portfolio of carbon removal solutions that we need and locking a bunch of different possibilities out. But when I read that language, it talks about this definition of lithospheric storage, which basically means, in my understanding, anything that's below ground.
Yeah.
And that allows more things. It allows charm, it allows bio-oil, it allows potentially terrestrial biomass sequestration. And there's also a component of storage in oceans, which would potentially allow a range of marine CDR pathways. Am I reading that correctly? And what does that mean to be sort of potentially part of the storage definition, but not named, like DACs and BECs and potentially biochar carbon removal?
The way that I would think about the CSCF is, first, you need to make sure that there's nothing in there that prevents you from ever being considered, right? And before, when we had a hard selection criteria of geological storage, we had such an exclusionary criterion, for example. So I think the expansion of the geological storage to lithosphere, to oceans, is critical if we want to keep this framework open. So I share your read that in general, the direction of travel, this is not decided yet, right? Like the timeline is Ideally, early next year before the election in June in Europe, but probably it's going to be late next year, early 2025. So until then, we don't really know, but this is the direction of travel. But then, so if you've passed the exclusionary criteria, the next best thing you want to achieve is really to be explicitly mentioned. And I don't think this is the particularly preferable way to do it. I think we should just have principles or criteria and that's it. But the way this CSCF works is you have definitions of, for example, permanent removal that mention explicitly specific technologies. At the moment, DACs and BECS, according to the Agri Committee, it should also be biochar carbon removal. And that will make a big difference because that will essentially set the stage for which technologies are going to be preferred. For example, in the future, also in compliance market integrations. So yeah, you can still make it in if you're not explicitly mentioned, but you're going to have a harder time.
And like specifically, I mean, and I know some of this is uncertain, but how do you see the path forward for, there are many important pathways that aren't mentioned, enhanced rock weathering, and then, a range of bikers pathways besides biochar, marine CDR pathways. So if you're one of these pathways, number one, what is your path forward if you're not explicitly mentioned? Because you and I were talking about, do we have to wait for new parliamentary action, or will there be an administrative path forward where you can apply to a committee and be approved? And then number two, if you are a practitioner of CDR working on one of these pathways, what specifically would you recommend that a company or a scientist or researcher submit for this current call for comment? Like, what do we ask for if you're a Charm or if you're an enhanced weathering company?
Let me start with the second question. So what they're looking for right now is really evidence of voluntary carbon market standards, methodologies, and monitoring, reporting, and verification. So there's not really a point in submitting anything that's not exactly this in the current call. What they ideally imagine you're doing, algae sinking. Ideally, what you would like to see in this situation is a submission that shows that algae sinking is already being done according to XYZ standard, and that it is essentially tried and tested to a certain extent. That will give the Commission, in this case, the confidence to prioritize it as a technology in the future to work on. So ideally, this is the kind of information they want. If the Commission gets 3 or 4 or 5 different reference points for one technology of what is already being done on, say, MRV, that might give them more confidence to prioritize it sooner. So the whole objective of this consultation is to inform the meeting in October and to help the expert group prioritize which technologies to develop certification for first. So this is
that could be an administrative process and not a new act of parliament.
Exactly. And this is important to understand that the Commission at this point is not working on the text. They're not working on the actual legislative text. That's with the Parliament and the Council. What they are working on is they are basically they're doing, I would say, more of the technical work. They're doing more of the operational work. They're actually prioritizing the technologies and developing methodologies for certification specifically for them. Whereas if you want to work on the actual text, and it's kind of already a bit too late, I would say, for this round, because a lot of the positions have already been formed over the last 6 to 9 months. There's still, as I said, the parliamentary vote is in October. The Environment Committee has not published its position. So I wouldn't say it's too late. People can still engage, but the window is closing. And I think if I were a supplier of a specific technology, I would basically look, is there anything in there right now that is excluding my technology from the CRCF? Are the current positions of the Council and the Parliament helping? Or is there still maybe a few tweaks that are needed? And that's what I would focus on in the next 2 months.
Yeah.
And in parallel and after, I would work more with the Commission because that's where a lot of the actual implementation is going to happen.
Lots more to talk about. I feel like we could talk about this longer, but if you are a supplier in the audience, I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting a submission in. If you have a methodology, if there's a published methodology, if there's a Puro standard, if you're working with isometric, whatever, like if you have any sort of defined protocol, I would submit that. And as Sebastian points out, look at some of this language and see if there's anything that would keep you out, because I think having to wait for a future act of parliament to get in would be a very bad outcome for any particular CDR pathway. And also, and it's a complicated issue. There are groups out there, Carbon Removal Alliance, Carbon Business Council, if you're in Europe, Negative Emissions Platform, Carbon Gap, who can kind of help you with this. And I think many would be willing to. The time is short, though. It's next Friday. So again, Megha's put the link in the chat a couple times, but please, if you are a supplier, engage in that process. Let's move on a little bit. Can you just kind of give a quick sense of, so, net zero by 2050, you have a 2030 target. What's going on with the 2040 target discussion from is it just a discussion, or is there legislation or policy or regulation that's going to emerge from this discussion? Where do you see that going?
And maybe it's helpful to describe, because there's probably a lot of folks from the US as well in the audience. I work a lot on US policy, and there's quite big differences in terms of the predictability and longevity of kind of these policies in Europe versus the US. And so in Europe, if we pass a 2040 target, that is pretty safe. Like, that's built in, that's unlikely to be overturned in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's why it's so important. And right now there's been a submission, people can look at all the results. I think there were over 200 submissions. There's a strong preference for having a dedicated CDR target, potentially even a twin target for kind of nature-based carbon removal, for the lack of a better term, and industrial carbon removal, as it's called in Europe. It has many other names around the world, but it's always the same thing. And that's kind of the direction of travel. And that would be really, really important, because if we have a 2040 binding removals target across 27 member states, a lot of other things will follow from that, including public procurement. Right now in Europe, we have a LULUCF target of 310 megatons by 2030, but that's not really going to help a lot with industrial removals. We've got a non-binding target by the Commission of 5 megatons by 2030 of industrial removals. And we've got in the Net Zero Industry Act a 50 megatons by 2030 storage capacity target. That's all we have. So that there's no other, and nation states, we can talk about this. Nation states are moving ahead. Denmark has a 2 megaton biochar carbon removal target by 2030, which is amazing. So some nation states are moving ahead, but the 2040 target will be really important to kind of set the stage for everyone and drive these other national policies. Because, and I should mention this, budgets and taxes are not EU. That's managed at the national level. So when you think about public procurement, that's a national thing.
And we're going to talk about national level policy in just a second. For the 2040, are there any, is this a pending parliamentary discussion? There was a previous call for comment. And I know there are a number of different kind of related, the NZIA, and there are other things that are happening that are tangentially related. Are there any sort of policy advocacy action items for either organizations or individual companies or what have you with respect to these 2040 targets?
So maybe, and it was implicit, but I'll make it explicit. The way that any policy here works, it always starts with the Commission, and it always starts with consultations, right? And the Commission does consultations, they gather data, they then put forward a proposal. For example, the 2040 target is currently with the Commission, and in Q1, the Commission is going to put forward a proposal, and then it goes to Parliament, Council, and so on. For example, EU ETS, CDR ETS integration, the Commission is in the very early stages of gathering data. And with all of this, the earlier you can get in, the earlier you can be part of these submissions, connect with the Commission, and the more influence you'll have on the outcome. Whereas with other things like the CSCF right now is already way more advanced, right? Or the green claims, for example. So you should try always to get in, like with everything, quite early in the process.
That makes a lot of sense. Want to move on now to ETS. You published a great blog this morning, which we'll put a link to in the chat, about what's going on, what's the opportunity. Can you explain briefly what the ETS is, what is the opportunity for carbon removal, and kind of what are the potential paths forward you see, maybe in ascending or descending order of preference?
So the ETS emission trading scheme, I mentioned it earlier, it covers the heavy polluting industries in the EU. It was set up in 2005, so a long time ago. It's by far the largest compliance market for carbon in the world. It's 87% of the global compliance markets just in one market. To give you an idea of size, 751 billion euros were traded last year. And the European Union made 39 billion just in revenue from the ETS last year. Now, to put this into perspective, the CDR share of the VCM last year, I think, was something around $230 million. So if we think about size and we think about the future direction of travel, we're talking about a step change, a multiplier for demand if CDR were integrated into the ETS or similar vehicle. That's why I think everyone should pay attention to this. The problem with this is we're talking 2030, at earliest 2030, potentially later. So it feels really distant, and I can appreciate that a supplier that's trying to raise investment for the next 2 years might not think too much about 2032, but it would completely change the game if CDR were included. So this is maybe just for context why this matters. And also in terms of one interesting data point, last year, the average price for an allowance in the ETS was 80 euros. It passed 100 euros at times. And again, this, in the CDR space, we always talk about this kind of golden threshold of $100. It gives you a good idea. And these allowance costs are going to go up because there's going to be less and less allowances. So we're going to reach a point where CDR could be very cost competitive, which we need to be careful with as well, because if we just integrate CDR and CDR is cheaper than emission reductions, we can get into a perverse incentive situation. So that leads to kind of how do we integrate this, right? But maybe in brief, and you can read the blog, I really recommend it if you're interested in the topic, but our recommendation after having analyzed this in great depth is basically 3 things. First, the ideal setup is actually if we had a parallel system like DTS only for removals. So a removal trading scheme. Again, this is built on a lot of academic literature. It's not just my personal opinion. But the removal trading scheme would essentially allow us to, dedicated CDR target in Europe, dedicated compliance market for removals, and not mix up the two, which would be much clearer and better. That's very unlikely to happen. It's very unlikely that Europe is going to set up something as big as DTS just for removals. So let's put it out there. Let's talk about it, but it might not happen. The next best thing, if we integrate, would be having an intermediary. It could be the government. There's a lot of talk of a carbon central bank modeled after, the European Central Bank to manage the supply and the price of CDR. Because as I just said, if suddenly CDR becomes cheaper than an allowance, you get into a weird situation where a company is not incentivized to reduce emissions, but to rather buy removals. And so a carbon central bank could manage this flow, buy in advance, release at different times. And that seems to be a preferred option also in the literature. And the third thing is just very clear integration of the CRCF. We should only use permanent removals as certified in the CRCF. We shouldn't use, short durability removals for fossil emissions in something like a compliance market. So durable carbon removal from the CRCF should be the base for any of these integrations. But yeah, read the blog and comment on it. We look forward to hearing from you on it.
And that goes back to the importance of the CRCF. If you're locked out of the CRCF, you're going to be locked out of the ETS. So again, if you're a supplier, engage. I put a link Megha put a link in the chat to a post earlier this week from Robert Hoagland that I thought was really excellent, defining and quantifying the role of CDR. And he kind of broke it out into a couple buckets, but basically it's sort of aligned with this idea, the Oxford like for like idea of durable net zero, where you, as you just said, fossil carbon emissions can only be neutralized with durable permanent carbon removal. However, emissions from agriculture that are more temporary could potentially be neutralized by short cycle removals. Do you envision, is it possible that we could end up in a world where the compliance market and or policy would make this distinction and kind of, instead of twin targets, you mentioned twin targets within removals for short cycle and permanent. Is that possible? Because ultimately, I think the really important thing will be what the ETS does. Do you think that's possible in the ETS, or is that just too much?
I mean, if we also look at the type of industries that are included in the ETS, it's the heavy polluting industries, and something like agriculture will probably be the last to be integrated in it. And we have other vehicles also for short-lived emissions like the LULUCF, right? And that already has removal targets. So I think a lot of people also in the CRCF and at the EU stage are pushing for that distinction, both in terms of targets, but also in terms of the vehicles used to achieve it. And that's a risk actually, because agriculture is strong. The agricultural lobby in Europe, half of the European budget goes to agriculture. It's the primary thing that drives probably French EU policy, for example, right? So there's a big push to kind of blur the lines. And I think that's something that our industry probably has to be quite firm on to do exactly what you just said and what Robert also said.
Yeah, and I think it's really important too, because, in carbon removal, it's not like anyone objects to soil carbon or forest carbon. I think it's how you're going to use those reductions. And I think that the Oxford, Eli Mitchell Larson and others work on like for like and durable net zero, and also Robert's post, I think really create a pathway to kind of eliminate this sort of opposition that has been falsely kind of set up between nature-based and industrial or permanent removal. So hopefully we can kind of move in that direction. One more kind of topic, I think, in the prepared questions, and then we're going to hopefully leave, we're going to leave 15 to 20 minutes at the end for audience questions. So please continue to keep those coming. And if you can, put them in the Zoom Q&A channel. It's very difficult to manage them if they're in the chat. Last question, broad topic, maybe a couple follow-up questions, but just on national level policy, you've referenced a few times. OpenAir is a big fan of subnational policy in the US, state level carbon removal policy. We think it can be very impactful. I think national policy in Europe is very analogous in that regard. OpenAir has worked on a policy in Luxembourg called the LNet that Sebastian wrote a great blog about a few weeks ago, and we'll put links to that in the chat. But can you talk about, and Sebastian has written a great analysis of what's going on at the national level, both in terms of carbon removal policy. So can you just kind of give a larger frame? So you mentioned procurement. What else happens at the national level? And then maybe some examples of interesting things that you see happening at the national level in Europe.
Definitely. And yeah, you mentioned we did an analysis of 31 European states. So we took the 27 EU member states and then Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and the UK. And if people are interested, we did the same for the 50 US states. Because again, going that granular is actually really helpful when you're trying to prioritize where to focus your efforts. I would say what we see in Europe, if we just kind of brief kind of takeaways from that analysis, there's a couple of real champions, right? Like Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, they really stand out. Why do they stand out? They have dedicated CDR targets. I already mentioned Denmark. Switzerland has actually gone so far to define their targets and also define how much they're going to procure from abroad. They defined already they're going to procure 5 megatons from abroad, for example. And then even in Sweden, for example, they've created a reverse auction scheme, which people don't really talk about, but it's 3.3 billion euros for BECCS, which, is, people talk a lot about DAC hubs and so on. This is a similar size just for BECCS, which is huge. So individual countries are moving ahead. Norway is creating an incentive, which is basically exactly the same, or they want to create the same incentive as 45Q, 177 euros, I think, pretty much matching the US. So nation states are moving ahead. They're setting more ambitious targets. And it's something that I think we should really focus on in Europe, because in general, and this is also interesting compared to the US, European member states have more progressive environment policies than a lot of US states. And that creates a good basis to work with. You see an East-West divide. So Eastern Europe is actually quite behind. If you look at it in the maps we created, you can really see it black and white. They're quite far behind on targets, on policies. And another thing worth noting is the big states in Europe, which really carry the heavyweight, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, they're also behind. They're not taking the leadership role yet that I think they could and should. And again, maybe we were going to talk about Germany later, which we definitely see a lot of movement now. But yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing. And LNet, just a quick shout out, because that's a great example of a small country in Europe. Luxembourg is very small. I think they're 0.3% of Europe's emissions. So they don't get a lot of attention, but they've actually put together with OSC, I think, did a tremendous amount of work here. The LNet, which is essentially, I don't know how much people know about the feed-in tariff that was used for renewable energies, but it's trying to essentially guarantee a price to producers of CDR, and not just nationally, because Luxembourg is quite small. So they went immediately also from abroad. And that is it's a fantastic blueprint that we wrote about, just that other countries could potentially adopt as well. But yeah, definitely recommend looking at the nation states as well in Europe.
We put a link to that in the chat. Also, I think one of really interesting things about LNet, I think it's a great policy, but also I think, and this is really a Chris Neidl initiative, but just the policy development exercise, it was an open source, like multiple meetings of stakeholders and experts kind of elaborating this policy. And we'll put a link to that in the chat as well. It's all up on YouTube. I think that's just a really powerful policy development model that OpenAir is looking to advance in other European countries as well. Sorry, Sean, Lux 10. It's called Lux 10 now. But so just, is it fair to say that if you divide policy and regulation into carrots and sticks, the sticks happen at the European level and the carrots pretty much have to happen at the national level, because the national level is what has the taxing authority.
Broadly speaking, yes. We also see, for example, the ETS is European, the emission sharing regulation, ESR, is at national level. So for some industries, the stick is also still in the hands of the government. But I would generally think about it like that. And when you think about policy instruments, tax incentives, public procurement, reverse auction schemes, that's all national, right? So we really need to focus on that.
So the things, the ways that on the carrot level, the ways that Europe is maybe behind the US, for example, the money that was in the IRA or the infrastructure bill, 45Q, DAC hubs, those would typically be funded at the national level. So that's where you need to really focus that kind of advocacy. You mentioned Germany. Let's talk about Germany. You're from Germany. I know you've done a lot of work in Germany. Maybe can you talk about what's going on with CDR in Germany? I mean, there's an incredible diversity of CDR companies starting up in Germany. It's just super impressive, just across every CDR pathway. And it's really interesting entrepreneurial and commercial activity. But what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on policy? I believe you are spinning up a new German industry association for carbon removal. Can we spend a couple minutes on Germany, and then we're going to end our prepared questions and flip it over to Megha to talk about some audience questions.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm obviously German. I work in the German Chancellery. I've got a big personal interest and experience in Germany, but also looking just on the stats, it's the biggest economy in Europe. It's the fourth biggest economy in the world. So it can have a real impact on the development of CDR. And frankly, I've also seen Europe move slowly if France and or Germany are not behind something. And at the moment, they're not strongly behind the CSF, for example. So we need Germany, in my view, on board. Germany has a unique setup to push for CDR. So first, they have big economy, big purchasing power. They have a lot of big industrial players who could be big buyers of CDR, also in the voluntary carbon market, right? They have academic excellence, and they have a strong environmental agenda. The Greens, for example, they're now in government. They're actually setting a very strong agenda. So this is kind of the positive side. Now, the reality is, until a year ago, nobody would have said, let's push for CDR in Germany, because we actually have a ban on the transport and storage of CO2 instituted by the Greens in the 2000s. And now, interestingly, and this is what sparked my interest, a Green minister, Robert Habeck, is going against historic party line to overturn this decision, because he's embraced, especially point source CCS, as a future-proof climate technology. And so that was what really started the process. We started kind of creating roundtables, just talking to a lot of people. And eventually we decided that we needed the EU's first national CDR association to push for CDR at the national level in an ambitious way. The DVNE, I mean, we came about, so DVNE, Deutscher Verband für negative Emissionen, we have 31 founding members, way more than I expected to see in Germany. A lot of people came out of the woodwork, which was amazing to see across the whole spectrum of CDR. So it goes from soil carbon afforestation all the way to, BECCS and DACs. We've got probably we're going to be around 50 members by end of year. There's a lot of people who've expressed interest. I was elected chair of the board there, so I'm going to have a strong role, at least in the next 2 years. And we really have three things that we want to work on in this government, and that links to a lot of the things that we already discussed. First, Germany, again, German policy, I'm not going to go too deep, but they have a coalition treaty where they say what they're going to do for the next 4 years in the current government. And so they commit in advance to what they're going to be doing. And what's in there, for example, is they will set 2035, 40, 45 CDR targets, which is amazing. Like Germany is going to have 2035 CDR targets. So this is an incredible opportunity to go beyond the 2040 EU targets. Second, it's currently working on a carbon management strategy. The early details were already revealed. It's mainly industrial CCS, but also some DACs and BECCS. And third, they're working on a CDR strategy for the government. So we want to work on these three pillars to set the stage for future governments as well. In Germany, we have a decent amount of consistency across governments, especially if I look at the current one. And so that's what we're doing. And in terms of upcoming things that might be relevant also for people who are based in Germany, we're recruiting our team. We're hosting a parliamentary breakfast in October, but that's closed doors. But we're having our launch event in December, 11th of December in Berlin. So if you're interested, definitely let us know. We'll share more details in the near future. But yeah, get in touch with me or info@dvne.org if you want to join, fund, support, collaborate, whatever it is.
That's fantastic. And we put a link to the DVNE LinkedIn page on the in the chat. So I think you can connect that way too, or I guess connecting with you.
Yeah. Website coming next week. So for now, LinkedIn page.
And also shout out to OpenAir's German language. This is CDR program called Das ist CDR. And there have been some great episodes. I'll put a link to those archival episodes in the chat, and we'll have more coming up this fall. Sebastian, this has been great. Thank you so much. Great talking to you as always. And thank you for joining us. And Megha, are you there? And you want to come on and there you go.
Oop, top of my head. All right. Yeah. So quite a few questions. I think maybe just starting with some questions on like the fragmentation of the policies and how it might come together. So first we had a question on just, the permanence issue, which I think you discussed quite early on. You have the UNFCCC talking about 1,000 years. You have others talking about 100 or 10,000 or 250. So how do we eventually just resolve the discrepancy? And like for providers and practitioners, how do you kind of think about where you need to end up in this?
So obviously, I'll focus more on what's currently happening in Europe and less on my personal opinion. So in Europe right now, the talk is in the CSF, for example, there's talk of several centuries, which, again, where we draw the line is pretty arbitrary, right? But I think most people will agree that several centuries onwards is what we need to deal with the current crisis. Obviously, it's a bit more challenging. We shouldn't compensate fossil emissions with something that's only a couple of years. But once you start talking about a couple hundred years, I think we're already in a good territory. And that's the direction of travel of the EU. They don't really differentiate right now between thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. And we might see what the Commission comes up in their certification methodologies. But at least in the draft text, that's not currently being done. And
is there already discussions of like, how does this fit in with what the US is doing or what the UN, or is it kind of too early to be worrying about those questions? There's surprisingly little linkages. I remember I hosted a panel in Basel earlier this year, also with Fabian Ramos from the Commission. And one of the questions that came at him first off was, why did you not use IPCC definitions in the CRCF? Yeah. Right? Like, it's surprising how kind of everyone's reinventing the wheel. My hope is that maybe the CRCF will create a blueprint that other countries will build on in future. And maybe also the IPCC link is going to get stronger. But at the moment, there's quite a lot of differences. Okay, yeah. And do you see potential for the EU ETS to kind of spread into a global emissions trading system? I know not every country really thinks about it that way, but do you kind of see that will grow beyond the EU, or is it likely to kind of remain as its own block? I really cannot see that. Like, okay. if I think about how complicated compliance markets are and how little support there is for compliance markets in a lot of pockets around the world. Like, for example, I just cannot imagine a federal compliance market in the US anytime soon. Yeah. So a global one, I really can't, because we're talking about taxpayer money, right? So I think it's going to be European for now. And then there are a lot of compliance markets. There's a UK compliance market. There's a New Zealand. There's California. There's one in China. So we're going to see a lot of different compliance markets, and that might integrate CDR, but I cannot imagine this kind of global one. Yeah. And I guess, are you also saying it would be hard to imagine like some of those individual compliance markets integrating together with one another, even if it doesn't ever become fully global? I think that's very complex stuff. Like in Europe, we have, for example, I didn't talk about it today, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is trying to kind of account for, if you want to work within Europe, you want to sell products within Europe, how do we adjust for the additional cost that European companies have versus companies outside, and how we make up for also carbon emission differences? That's super complex stuff. So if I now imagine kind of trying to connect two carbon markets, it might happen at one point, but it's a lot of bureaucracy to do so. Yeah, definitely. Okay. And then just on what you mentioned on reductions being included on the framework as well, which, I think a lot of us don't really necessarily agree with. How, if at all, how do they kind of defend why that should be included in the same framework? The original, again, I heard this many times from the Commission, it's peatland restoration. And again, I'm not a peatland restoration expert. From what I understand, after a couple of decades, if managed well, peatlands can become a sink and actually remove carbon. But until you get there,
it only reduces emissions.
Yeah.
But because they become a sink eventually, they decided to integrate it into a removals framework. And now that's the official explanation. My read is that there's a lot of pressure from a lot of groups to open up the door a little bit to reductions. And what we're seeing now is that door that was opened a little bit in the original draft is being pushed wide open by the agriculture proponents in the EU. And so actually, if anything, we're seeing potentially a further dilution of that line, which I really hope is not going to reduce the credibility of this framework. Because if suddenly you have a lot of reductions in a removals framework, we're going to be in a dangerous territory.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then just turning to some of the different sort of methodologies or technologies, a couple of things are maybe not clearly included. So ocean technologies as well as enhanced rock weathering. Could you just talk a little bit about like where you see that fitting in, if and how we can get that included, or what do you think is the most likely situation for those?
So I think in general, in the direction of travel right now, I don't think they're excluded. They're not explicitly mentioned, but they're not excluded. Like especially for enhanced weathering, enhanced rock weathering, I think there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of talk of mineralization also in the latest drafts. So I would say that that's fine. Oceans is also not excluded, but oceans is also in Europe, especially people coming from the US. In Europe, it's very low on the agenda. Like I'm very surprised how different the priorities are in the US and the EU when it comes to how people would rank, let's say, the technologies. But oceans is much lower in Europe than the US. But in general, the way that this is currently done, as I said, is in the expert group, these technologies are being discussed pretty much one by one. Not all get time in the spotlight, and then they're prioritized. And what I think will happen is you'll get 2, 3, maybe 4 that get prioritized in the first round, and then you might get more that get prioritized at later stages. And the industry, these sub industries, I would really recommend team up, find all the others who work in your sub industry, because the other industries are doing that. So if you're not doing it already, you're already at a disadvantage. Team up with your competitors, whoever they are, and advocate together, because that's the only way I think you're going to get the ear and eyes of the commission and the expert group.
Yeah, definitely good advice for anyone working on this kind of stuff. Okay, and then we had someone ask a question on biochar, and just, biochar is obviously a bit more advanced in where it is. And so do you worry at all that kind of including it on equal footing with things like DAX or BEX puts those things at a disadvantage and kind of crowds it out? Or do you think those can still kind of develop in parallel?
I think it's less like the crowding out language. I don't think applies to such a minuscule market as CDR, right? With such a huge potential. So the crowding out argument, I don't buy. Obviously, we need to be careful what we put on an equal footing, and not all biochar is created equal, right? There's a lot of biochar that should not be deemed permanent removal and should not be on a par with DAX and BEX. And so I think what the commission really has to do now with the expert group is define the criteria for which biochar produced in certain ways has permanence of more than 1,000 years, and at what percentage, right? And I think there's increasing amount of evidence for that, which, for example, the Agriculture Committee of the Parliament is endorsing. But I just want to be very clear. Biochar, I think, is much more varied than something like DAX or BEX. So it's really important that we define what type of biochar, but then it could well work out.
Got it. Okay. We had a few questions on sort of the VCM versus sort of compliance market and the role that they play. So for one thing was just talking about what it gets accepted into VCM versus what we in the CDR world talk about. And I think particularly things like afforestation credits and things are in the VCM, but don't really get a lot of credit from kind of those of us in the CDR world. How do you think about, either getting those two onto the same page where the VCM and compliance markets talk about these things in the same language, or do you think that's never going to happen and we'll always kind of have these potentially lower quality credits continuing to be exchanged on the VCM?
Big question about how the VCM will evolve over the next decades with compliance markets. I mean, first, when we're talking about compliance markets, we're really talking about 2030, 2035, and so on, right? And so I think the VCM is here to stay for a while. Even then, I mean, for example, I spoke about most likely in the ETS, we're going to have DAX, BEX, maybe biochar included, which means that all the other credits will not be traded in compliance markets. They would still only exist in the VCM. So there's a role for the VCM for many years to come. The other thing is, for example, in Europe right now, and this is the request for information right now, the consultation that's currently going on, there's a strong desire to build on the foundations of the VCM. So I think if the VCM engages properly with the current political process, there will be a lot of linkages. It's an open question, what's the role of standards in the future, for example, in Europe? But right now, there's a strong interest and curiosity to learn from the VCM and to build on it in the future for public procurement, for compliance markets, and so on. So I think it's up to us in the VCM to create those linkages.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. And do you kind of see the VCM remaining, as large as it is relative to compliance markets, or growing bigger or smaller as we progress and as compliance markets are just a bit more defined in the future? Like, will we still have a large VCM? Yeah.
The thing with VCMs is they're just a bit less predictable, I feel. The good thing about compliance markets is, if we know, I don't know, there's a 2035, 40, 45 removals target. We know which industries are going to be covered when. We know what percentage of removals they will have to purchase. A business will be able to plan out for 10, 15 years in Europe what kind of demand they can expect for certain removals. That's amazing, right? Right now in the VCM, what we're seeing is, for example, the non-removals fraction is tanking and removals are growing. But overall, the VCM is going through a huge shakeup, right? And so that probably 1 year ago, people didn't predict. I remember 1 year ago, people were like, oh yeah, the VCM is going to keep growing to whatever, 4 billion this year. That's not going to happen. And so I think predictions on the whole VCM are really tricky. Predictions on the CDR section are maybe a bit easier because we're seeing more growth. But again, I think the VCM is impossible to predict compared to a compliance market, which is why I'm very excited about government procurement, about compliance, because it's going to help the sector scale predictably and properly.
Yeah. Okay. Just going back to the way this develops in different countries, someone asked, has the EU defined an effective carbon price in order to respond to the competition from the US bipartisan infrastructure law /IRA? So, things like excluding low carbon intensity products from states or regions with something like a price on carbon, or just, how will US exports of low carbon intensity products affect EU markets as we're sort of both working on the policies in two different regions?
So on the carbon, that's kind of what I mentioned earlier. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is exactly this, right? Like if you're producing a good in the US with way more emissions embodied in it, and you're exporting that to Europe, Europe will have you pay the difference compared to a European company producing the same good under compliance markets laws and so on. So that's what the CBAM is. And that's exactly what we're trying to use to balance the two. Obviously, the IRA also doesn't just have carbon. It's not just about carbon prices. It's also about investment. And on the investment side, that's where Europe is currently way further behind. We discussed it earlier. It has to happen at the national level. So it's kind of, we don't have that powerful federal tool that we can use to deploy a ton of money, for example, at DAX, like in the US. So in that sense, we're a bit behind.
Yeah. Okay. And do you have a view on how these markets might develop? This is maybe outside of the scope of this conversation, but someone was interested in like how this might develop in countries like India, and whether compliance and voluntary markets are likely to develop in a similar way. Have you seen any kind of movement on that, or reflections of what that might look like?
So China's interesting. China has a huge VCM. Just in terms of the VCM and the credits, China is by far the biggest player globally. And they also have a compliance market. It's tiny. It's 500 million euros or dollars. I forgot, but 500 million roughly, compared to what we mentioned earlier in terms of 40 billion in Europe, for example. But they do have a compliance market, and it's set to probably grow a lot. So I would look at China more than anything on that front. When it comes, my personal take is I really hope that China and India are gonna, as soon as it becomes attractive, will go after something like enhanced weathering in full force. In a similar way that China has gotten the price of PV down to what it is today and allowed the green transition, I hope that it will do the same for carbon removal. We're probably going to put in the initial investments here in the US and Europe, and at some point China and India are going to come and scale it to oblivion. And I think that would be fantastic for the world. But again, that's just my pipe dream.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll keep an eye on it. Okay, and then maybe just one or two more. Do you expect the CRCF to have third-party quality assurance requirements built into it?
I mean, how exactly it's going to do it is still not clear, but it must have to a certain extent, right? Right now, it's still not clear, for example, what type of institutions it's going to build in-house versus what it's going to outsource. My take is with Europe, it's going to probably do the rule setting, and then it's going to have a process where parties will apply to abide to those rules and help control them. And we might have third-party auditors in that process as well. But yeah, it's still way too early to say how that's going to look.
Fair enough. I think that's kind of all we have time for. Any kind of last thoughts or, things you want to leave people with before we go?
No, just I hope that people that I managed to demystify a little bit the very complex European policy process. And yeah, follow me on LinkedIn, get in touch, read the blogs, comment on them, engage. And yeah, it's a great time to work on CDR policy. And in Europe, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. So hopefully a lot of people will engage.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Sebastian. I have high hopes that we can export the chat for you guys so you have all those links, but I'm not going to make any promises because I am not the person in charge of doing it and I'm not sure it's possible. But in any case, we will send out the recording. And I think Toby's just pulling up what we have on next. So on September 12th, which is next Tuesday, on This is CDR, we have Next Gen. Then we're taking a week off for New York Climate Week on the 19th, but we'll be back on the 26th with Eva Tamo, who is going to talk about the UNFCCC process and Article 6 a little bit more. And yeah, this is what you can look out for next week. Please go on to Eventbrite and find that if you haven't already and register to see you then. All right, Seb, thanks so much for being with us and hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you.